Good morning, students. Today, I will discuss to you the values of poetry, factors that influence appreciation of poetry, and the suggestions in teaching poetry appreciation. But first, I will give you the definition of poetry. So, what is poetry? Poetry is an artistic expression of thoughts and emotion in rhythmical language, and it is a kind of verbal music. Just like a musical score, it must be interpreted well so that one can understand its message. And, but anyways, I know that you already encounter of what is poetry. So let's proceed on the values of poetry. So first, poetry enriches children's experiences in a way that they can also experience the message of emotion of poetry. For example, if a certain poem gives the emotions of being sad, then the reader of that poem also feel the sadness that conveyed by that poem. And then number two, the second value of poetry is it develops correct enunciation and pronunciation of words. When you utter the words, of course, you have to pronounce a better enunciation and pronunciation of words, and you will do it many times to achieve the perfect pronunciation. So, it really helps develop your pronunciation and enunciation. And the third values of poetry is develops literary appreciation. When you read here or when you're the one to create your own poetry, since you experience poetry, you can at least feel the satisfaction or the enjoyment it brings that will make you motivated to experience other literary works. And then fourth, it develops the imagination. Poetry develops person's imagination because we can make a poetry from our thoughts, emotions, as well as our wide imagination. Since our brain cannot stop thinking, it also can stop imagining. And then, you can write immediately what you have imagined so that you can create a poem or a certain literary piece. And then for if you understand what the poem is all about, you can imagine in your mind of what the author wants to portray with that poem. Fifth, values of poetry. It enlarges your vocabulary. When you encounter poetry, you also encounter difficult or new words. So, you have to see dictionary to find the definition for that words. And when you're the one to make your own poetry or your own poetic pieces, if you want to add something difficult words, you also have to see dictionary, and of course it must be related to your concept or to your idea, and that adds again to your vocabulary. Number 6, it improves the aesthetic sense. The senses like the sense of hearing, because poetry is an artistic expression, it can improve our sense of feeling. The emotions or the emotions and feelings that is being portrayed by a certain poem, it can also be reflected on us that will help develop our aesthetic sense of feeling. And then number 7, gives them pleasure and delight. Poetry gives you pleasure and delight because of its content. And because of its content, like the sensory images that makes you like it or that makes you love it. And then if when you're the one to make your own poetry, you can also gain pleasure and delight, especially when you have written your thoughts and emotions. And then number 8 and the last values of poetry, it improves your outlook in life and nature. Authors make poetry with life lessons that would really change your outlook in life. You can realize that your outlook in life is wrong with the help of a certain poetic piece that you have read. So that's all 8 values of poetry. So now let's proceed on factors that influence appreciation of poetry. There are 2 main factors that influence appreciation of poetry. So what are they? First, the teacher, and the second is the pupil. So, teacher. How the teacher became a factor that influenced appreciation of poetry? Of course, because a teacher is an educator and also serve as a role model. So, for others to appreciate poetry as a teacher, you should be as a teacher, you should be a trustworthy that you can be trusted in helping appreciating poetry. So how? You should have a broader background about poetry. Firstly, as a teacher, you should be a nature poetry lover. Because how can you teach your students to love, to appreciate poetry when you yourself do not love poetry in nature? If you are only forced to teach those children about poetry. So, it's useless. And then, as a teacher also, you should know the basic realities like love, hatred, sadness, happiness, so that you can teach children, you can interpret some examples or some literary works or some poetic pieces to your students. If you do not have enough knowledge about those basic if you don't have the wide knowledge about the basic realities in life, well, you will not be a successful teacher in appreciating poetry. And then, second and factor that influence appreciation of poetry is the pupil. So, for the pupils or for the students to become a factor that influence poetry, it should be start from a teacher. Students may broaden their knowledge about poetry by letting them or allowing them read some poems and interpret some poetic pieces. And then they must be given enough time to interpret poems, and do not pressure them or do not force them to like a certain poem, because it depends on them if they love or like a certain poem. Now let's move on to the suggestions in teaching poetry appreciation. First, do not assign a poem for home preparation. If there are assignments to be made, it should be material bearing upon the poem and essential to the understanding of it. And second, do not belabor the pupils with the study of facts. The more important is for learners to know, to understand, and how to interpret poems instead of giving them details about what is poem. And third, An excellent technique is for the teacher to read the poem first. You should read first the poem so that children or your students will have the guide on how to pronounce the words in the poems and how to read all the content of the poem. Then, see to it that they are listening to you. You may read the poem twice or thrice until they can get the rhythmical pattern or how to pronounce the words used in the poem. Then number 4, anticipate difficulties with some words. You should unlock difficult words before you read fully the poems to your students so that they can understand what they will going to read. And then the 5th one is make it a natural habitual practice to read poetry to children. You should always read poetry to children so that they can have the knowledge on how to read poetry, on what emotions we're going to put in reading poetry, and how to pronounce words that is used in some poetic pieces and other poetic matters. Then number 6, while reading or reciting a poem to children, the teacher can either stand or sit and have the children sit comfortably and relax too. So see to it that they are comfortable while listening to you and while reading a certain poem, because they can concentrate or they can focus on the poem if they are not comfortable with their positions or with their seats. And then the last one, do not force children to memorize poems. Instead, allow them to understand the poem. And that ends with our discussion for today. I hope you guys learned something from our discussion.